Hello, hello. Good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Barrett. I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, and that the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Aninawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. And we're gathered here tonight to celebrate the launch of Red Flags, A Reckoning with Communism for the Future of the Left by David Camfield. Many thanks to Fernwood Publishing for helping to make this evening a reality. Following a conversation featuring Tami, Gadir, and Andrew Loewen, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you are one of those here in person today, please raise your hand nice and high for me to see, and I'll come by with this wireless microphone just to ensure that you're heard on our tonight's live stream. And then I will be back at the end of the conversation just to review signing procedure. But for now, I'm here to introduce tonight's participants. And please join me in welcoming Tanya Andrew-Sichko, Acquisitions and Development Editor at Fernwood Publishing.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tanya Andrew-Sichko, and I'm an editor at Fernwood Publishing. Thanks for being here tonight, and thank you to McNally, of course, for hosting this event and for supporting Fernwood and our authors over the years, so thank you. I met David 10 years ago when I was editor of Briarpatch magazine, when I didn't know what I was doing, and David was introduced to me as friend of the magazine, and I'd knock on his email door periodically to ask him to weigh in on an issue or an angle or perspective, or just to set me straight on some basic understanding. Help me figure this out, David. And he would. And I realized that he shows up like this for many people who are doing their own wayfinding through the landscape of the left. So then 2 years ago, David called me and he said, I have an idea for a book and I'm not sure who will publish it, but I want to confront this problem of the nostalgia of the left. And I want the book to explain what happened after the Russian Revolution, and I want it to explain how it shaped the USSR and revolutions in China and Cuba. But it has to be short, and it has to be for people who aren't already familiar, because I want people to understand these histories and shape their ideas of a truly liberatory future. And I said, great, I think we should do this book. I think Fernwood should publish it, and I want to do it with you, and this is a great idea, and I think there's a need for it, and I think people will read this book. And then David said, great, I already have 3 chapters written. So that was the start of this, and I'm really glad that this book is in the world now, because I think this is a deeply needed book. And it's a book I wish existed many years ago as I was starting my own wayfinding. I think of this book as an extension of the wayfinding that David facilitates for so many of us. And I'm thankful to David for his commitment to the widest possible horizon for a liberatory future. So we will have a discussion tonight to celebrate the book, to dig into some of these ideas. We have 2 brilliant interlocutors. And I'm so grateful for both of you too for adding your perspectives to this, because I think we're in for a treat here. Our 2 interlocutors. So Tami Gadir is a researcher from RMIT University, Australia, specializing in the politics of global music industries. Her research on nightclub cultures culminated in a book called Dance Music, a feminist account of an ordinary culture. And her current project is about workers' choirs. Gadir is a member of the International Socialists and has served as a union delegate while being active in climate and anti-war movements. She has worked across 5 cities and 3 continents. Thank you, Tami. And Andrew Loewen has been active on the grassroots anti-colonial radical left for more than 2 decades, primarily in the prairies in Western Canada. He's a former editor of Briarpatch magazine. Thank you, Andrew, for introducing me to David initially, and works for a large public sector labor union in Winnipeg. And of course, David Camfield. David is a professor in the Labor Studies program and the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Manitoba. He's the author of Future on Fire, Capitalism and the Politics of Climate Change, We Can Do Better, Ideas for Changing Society, and Canadian Labor in Crisis, Reinventing the Workers' Movement. and he has written many articles on Marxism and left politics. He is on the editorial board and editorial advisory committee of Labor Le Travail and the advisory board of Alternate Routes. He has long been involved in social justice activism. He has served on the executive of the Winnipeg Labour Council and is active in the University of Manitoba Faculty Association. David's on the editorial board of Midnight Sun and hosts the podcast Victor's Children. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers, and thank you for being here.
Can people hear me okay out there? For folks who are standing, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 empty seats over here. So don't be shy if you want to come around the front and find one of those seats. We'll get right to it. The first question I have prepared for David. David, why did you write this book and why did you write it now?
So thanks for that. I wrote the book because I'd become aware over time of the increased interest in and support for different kinds of Marxist-Leninist politics, and more broadly, I think the spread of among people on the left of a kind of sympathetic or positive attitude to the so-called actually existing socialist societies. I probably first noticed this not quite 10 years ago, and it has just grown over time. And I just felt that this was a shift in ideas and politics on the left that deserved a response. So I thought I would do what I could to intervene there.
Okay, it's for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, I'm sure you'll be picking up a copy tonight. It's a very clearly written and an accessible book. It's not an academic book at all. It has a clearly defined political perspective, but the tone of the book is not polemical or strident, and I would say, I guess for those of us who've had the blessing and misfortune to be on the radical left for a number of years, sometimes folks on the radical left can save their most strident invective for others on the left. And sometimes it's people in a group of 10 who are, raging against another group of 6 people. This book is not in that tone. It's not in that register. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why you sort of adopted the tone you've used and what you hope to accomplish with the sort of register you're using in the book.
Well, I really wanted to write the book in a way that would engage people, regardless of whether they were coming to the book already more or less convinced of the kind of approach that it takes, or people who were coming to it really unsure or with skepticism and questioning about it, because I really wanted to make it as persuasive as possible. My point wasn't to denounce people that I disagree with, but really to try to use the most powerful reasoned arguments and evidence to persuade. And for people who are going to agree to disagree, at least hopefully they'll see it as a disagreement amongst comrades. And I guess that would be the other point I would just pick up on, because people that I would strongly disagree with and who would strongly disagree with me about this, we're on the same side of so many fights, right? In the times in which we live. And I just don't think it's helpful to adopt the kind of tones of unnecessary denunciation and so on. There are sharp disagreements, but we can have those sharp disagreements while treating each other respectfully as human beings and as comrades in struggles together.
Okay, and I've got one more question. Turn things over to Tami. Oh no, 2 more, and then we'll turn things over to Tami, I think. There's a few key terms in the book that I think it would be useful. Well, actually, maybe I'll do a little audience interaction here. How many people have had a chance to pick up the book and read part or all of it? Okay, so a handful. So this question will be relevant then for the folks who haven't had a chance to read the book. So there's a few key terms in the book that I think would be useful to just really briefly define before we dig into the main themes of the book. So those terms are anti-communism, anti-communism, actually existing socialism, and Marxist-Leninism. And if you need me to refresh you, David, on those, the first 2, anti-communism and anti-communism.
Okay, so anti-communism is the ideology which really goes back in its earliest form to the 1800s, which says any attempt to transform the world, to replace capitalism with a fundamentally different social order, communism, socialism, what have you, is a mistake. It's doomed, and it will produce, some form of tyranny. You can trace this back to the conservative reactionary response to the French Revolution. If you go back far enough, its ancestry, but it always has responded to every revolutionary challenge to capitalism with that kind of a response. And it basically will say that there's some kind of an essence, an evil essence that is there in all communist ideas across time and space that will inevitably lead to what they would call totalitarianism. And so therefore we should just accept what exists as the best of all possible worlds. And so if that's anti-communism, then anti-communism is a response to it which rejects it, recognizes that anti-communism is a defense of the unjust status quo, but it rejects it with, at the same time, adopting at the very least, sympathetic stance to the kinds of societies that call themselves or were called actually existing socialism, so-called. So the kind of society that first developed in the USSR at the end of the 1920s, and similar societies like that were created elsewhere. So that's a response to anti-communism, which this book does not share. So those two ideologies. And the third one was
actually existing socialism.
All right. So that was a term that was originally developed in the East Bloc to describe those societies, the USSR, Eastern European societies, and so on. I use it in the book in a strictly descriptive sense. I'm not agreeing with the original meaning of that term. It's just a label that I use to refer to these kind of societies based on the model that was first developed in the USSR from the late 1920s on. And the book develops an analysis of what that is, but uses that term differently than it was used by the ideologists of those states who developed it.
And the key actually existing socialist states that you look at on a sort of chapter by chapter basis being the former USSR, China and Cuba.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the last term is what is Marxist-Leninism? Is it just the ideas of Marx and Lenin, or something else?
Right, it's something else. Marxism-Leninism was a specific ideology that developed in the 1920s in the USSR, which pulled bits and pieces of ideas from phrases and words from Marx and Lenin, but it really was the ideology that was developed by what I would argue was a ruling class that was developing in the 1920s in the USSR. So this was the outlook, the ideology that it codified, and then that became spread globally through the communist movement. It became the official ideology. And in many, many ways, which we could discuss in the discussion, it had very little to do with the ideas of Marx and Lenin at all, but it was used as an ideology to justify that form of social organization.
And I think whether one is familiar with these things or not, David's book just does a very clear, job of explaining these things with reference to concrete examples in the world and history, it's just really, really useful and clarifying. It's a tonic. Lastly, before we turn some questions over to Tami, David, what's the difference between the kind of communism that you are advocating for in this book versus the communism of Marxist-Leninist communist parties or actually existing socialist states, such as the former USSR, China, or Cuba?
So what the book concludes with, the perspective that it adopts, but then the last chapter tries to develop an argument for these politics today, is the idea of the possibility and the necessity of breaking with capitalism and beginning a transition towards a society which would be classless and stateless and a society of freedom, which is the original meaning of communism. And the whole idea is that the process of breaking with capitalism and moving towards that society would have to be a liberatory process carried out by ordinary people, organizing themselves from below in a process of self-emancipation. So that's the kind of politics that the book argues for. Some people have used other terms for it, like socialism from below, but that's the basic idea. And that's very different from the politics of Marxism-Leninism. The book talks about the different varieties of that. There are different kinds of Marxism-Leninism in terms of the political programs that were developed. but they all have something in common, which is the idea that the society that you're aiming for can be achieved by a party or a guerrilla army or some other social force taking control of the state or destroying the existing state and creating a new state, and then from above moving in the direction of the society that's desired on the basis of state ownership. And so I think it's a very different kind of politics.
And yeah, just to maybe open this piece up a little bit before turning to Tami. So you say a few words about maybe the initial Russian Revolution and how that compared to a very different form of revolutionary struggle in Cuba and China?
Okay, so to make this as brief as possible, so the Russian Revolution was a remarkable social revolution in which the working class, which was small, concentrated in key cities, and the peasantry destroyed the old regime, the old monarchy of the Tsarist empire, and new extraordinarily democratic organizations that people had created themselves in the course of that struggle took power, and there was the beginning of an attempt to bring about social transformation. And there was a recognition by the leadership of the revolution that what had begun in Russia could not possibly succeed in Russia. It would have had to spread because Russia was, extraordinarily underdeveloped by to use the terms we might use today. And then that revolution was, I argue in the book, destroyed. It was ultimately what you could call a modernizing counter-revolution that ended with the consolidation of a new ruling class that used the language of the revolution to justify a new form of class exploitation that was established by the end of the 1920s. Then you had, there have been many other revolutions since the Russian Revolution, but to take the examples of China and Cuba, those were important revolutions that definitely destroyed all sorts of forms of injustice. In the case of China, it broke the rule of the old ruling class, which was closely intertwined with semi-colonial domination of China, established genuine national independence, unified most of the territory of the country, and carried out extraordinary modernization and industrialization, but I would argue never was actually moving in a direction of a classless and stateless society of freedom. And again, the Cuban Revolution, very, very different society from China, but again, similar kind of revolution, overthrew a terrible dictatorship, which had been the vehicle for the subordination of the country to the United States for many years, and brought about real social reforms in Cuba. But again, in neither China nor Cuba did ordinary people, the direct producers, ever actually take control of society democratically themselves. There was, from the beginning, a new ruling class that consolidated itself and oversaw the exploitation of the populations of those countries. So,
yeah, I think that covers it pretty well and succinctly. So over to you, Tami.
Thank you. And David, I just want to preface my questions with congratulations on a really well-written book about a topic that, is so large that you've managed to fit into something this size, which is pretty commendable. And not only that, to have argued something so effectively that, I'm familiar with these arguments, but quite frequently such things can just be asserted and people don't know necessarily why, they ought to think one way or another. And I think you've done a really good job of actually providing that reasoned argument in a way that hopefully, most interested people would be able to understand, and that's a huge achievement. So yeah, massive congratulations on an excellent book that I really enjoyed reading. Also, what a great title, Red Flags. Come on, I'm sure there are a lot of people that, kind of are kicking themselves and wanted to put that title in something about communism, but you did it, so well done. Regarding, just to get into a little bit more granular detail about some of the aspects of your book, it's really worthwhile the way that you tease out the different, I don't know, necessarily want to say excuses, but rationalizations for the forms of societies and perhaps the repression and the less ideal aspects of the societies that you are talking about, USSR, China and Cuba. You break some of those rationalizations down that are quite common in the left, some of which include these are socialist societies with glitches or with deviations, or things like these are socialist societies that are degenerated worker states, which is the Trotskyist conception of, they were kind of, there was proletarian rule, but things kind of went into a bureaucratic political elite, but it's still a degenerated workers' state. And you work really effectively to kind of explain not only that those things are inaccurate, but that they're not politically useful ways of understanding those societies. Can you speak a little bit more about, I mean, people can read the book for why it's inaccurate, I think, because the history's in there. But can you speak today a little bit more about why it's not politically useful to think about them in those terms?
I should start by just giving credit where credit is due. The title, Red Flags, came out of a conversation with Sean Carlton, my friend who teaches in history and indigenous studies here. So I didn't come up with a name by myself. In terms of why it's not politically useful, I mean, I think at the most basic level, to take that stand orients us to the idea that you could actually have a transition towards a better society that is one in which ordinary people exercise no democratic control of their own lives and are not involved in the process of change themselves, and which is extremely repressive and authoritarian in all sorts of ways. And then you hold up the process of moving in that direction and the goal as being somehow better than capitalism. And I think that's, fundamentally disorients people, and it doesn't resonate for very good reasons with billions of people, many people. And I think politically, the idea that the kind of society that would be possible and necessary as an alternative to capitalism would be one which is inherently better simply because the state's in control of economic resources and political power, the way it was in those societies, without asking the question about who rules through that state. I think that's politically extremely unhelpful. And then the other thing, because those societies go along with certain political traditions, Marxism, Leninism in its different forms, it orients people towards that as a tradition to get political ideas to grapple with the challenges of the 21st century. And while there have been many extraordinarily courageous people who fought and died in struggles for change and made really important accomplishments, who were Marxist Leninists and who are still in the world today, I think that political tradition is fundamentally not a useful resource, not a useful place for us to go in coming up with the ideas to understand the world today and to guide actions to change it.
I think that's a really important point about state-run things or nationalized economies or systems of production don't automatically mean you've achieved communism or that you're on the way to communism. That's a very common kind of leap, I think, that people make. If it's not run by the market, it's something on the way to communism. And you do a really great job in your book, and I think in a very interesting way of saying these were not even planned economies. I mean, they may have been called planned economies, but they were actually highly improvised, and they were responding in very, sometimes knee-jerk ways to the moments that they were, to the kind of effects of some of the decisions that they were making and of the world around them. So I found that particularly useful in your book. But one of the points you emphasize is the ad hoc relationship that these three societies, the USSR, China and Cuba, have had to left-wing revolutionary struggles in the wider world. And I think you do a great job of really internationalizing the conversation in this book. You do speak to a lot of, I mean, you only have time to mention them briefly, but you do refer to quite a lot of those different places. The reach is huge. And given the kind of internationalist character of the communist society that was sought by Marx and later by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, can you talk about the inconsistency of the relationship that these societies had with left-wing revolutionary struggles and why it matters that they had such a troubled or inconsistent relationship?
Right, so if you look at the history, you can see all sorts of examples of the USSR, China, Cuba supporting movements in certain places against imperialism, but then at other times not supporting them at all, and sometimes actively undermining struggles from below. So just to use a couple of examples for people who may not know the history. So the USSR both provided military support to the Republican forces in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, when you had a fascist coup and a civil war that ensued. the USSR did provide weapons to the republic that was fighting fascism. At the same time, they also actively they played a leading role in suppressing the revolutionary process which had broken out in Spain, the social revolution of workers and peasants, anarchists and anti-Stalinist Marxists in that society. I mean, to the point of actually assassinating revolutionaries during a civil war against fascism. China, supported various national liberation struggles, but then also opposed others, depending on how it was aligned politically, and swung in the early 1970s towards an alliance with the US against the USSR, which even saw China sending weapons to Angola to the side of the South African and US-backed reactionaries in that society during the war there. And in Cuba, again, supporting many struggles against imperialism in Latin America and in Africa, but at the same time also supporting certain reactionary governments, like in Guyana, the Forbes Burnham government, which was responsible for the assassination of the important revolutionary Walter Rodney. So you can see there's a very checkered history there. So then the question is, how do you make sense of all this? And I think a lot of people who are strongly supportive of those societies have a difficult time explaining what is just not disputable in terms of the facts. And I think the best explanation is to then see that these foreign policy decisions were the decisions of ruling classes who were taking these positions based on their calculation of what was best for their state, for their own rule in the world at that particular time. And so then that it shows it wasn't somehow just political mistakes or inexplicable decisions that were being taken, but rather these had their own logic when you understand them as decisions taken by rulers who were attempting to advance the interests of their own class in relation to the world that they were in at that particular moment.
Yeah, and I think like anti-imperialism is something that you address as well in your book, but you've done that in work outside, where you've addressed some of the complexities around how the left deals with anti-imperialism and in its relationships with some of these societies, but also with societies today that maybe doing something anti-imperialist or anti-US imperialism, and that the left, some parts of the left think that they just sort of have to automatically support because of that. I think this part of your book addresses that in a very helpful and historical way as well. So just to bring it sort of more into the present, and I'll kick back to Andrew after this question as well. You address some of the ways that a politically active person can relate, what happened in these places, which, are far away for many of us, half a century to a century ago, to what's happening in their here and now, or our here and now. Could you speak a little bit to this with reference to maybe some of the more recent developments in international politics that have taken place since you finished writing Red Flags? And I'm thinking, for instance, since this was published, Trump got elected, launched a trade war, started actively degrading public institutions, doubled down on transphobic and homophobic policies and rhetoric, and went after immigrants, and especially those who have been involved with a very political movement, a pro-Palestine movement. And this is just the US, right? But the US is obviously still a global kind of imperial hegemon, so all of this has really far-reaching implications and repercussions. So can you speak a little bit to how the lessons of the past that you address in that book help us make sense of how to mobilize in the present? Only a small question.
Yeah. Well, I guess one piece of that would be to think about what we can learn from the past about the struggle against the far right, because there's a long history in terms of the left and the struggle against fascism. And when it came to the official so-called communist movement under the leadership of the USSR, responding to the rise of fascism in Germany in the 1930s, it adopted an extraordinarily mistaken strategy where they refused to form an alliance with social democrats to stop the rise of fascism in Germany. I mean, it's a good case you can make that with a different political approach, that fascist Nazis might have been stopped in Germany because there was such a powerful but divided workers movement. But the official line from the Communist International, which was the international organization of communist parties led by, controlled by the USSR, the official line at the time was that the social democrats were worse than the fascists. They were social fascists, and so there couldn't be an alliance to stop the Nazis. in effect, then that helped Hitler come to power. Then recognizing what a disaster that had been, the Communist International swung to a different approach, which was the idea of trying to build an extremely broad alliance to stop fascism, which was called a Popular Front, which would extend not just to all different kinds of organizations of workers and farmers and those kinds of people, but also to a so-called progressive wing of the capitalist class. The idea was that there was a section of the ruling class that would be part of this alliance. That meant, of course, that you had to actually make all your demands and forms of organization acceptable to those partners if you were going to try to form that kind of an alliance, which led to all sorts of political contortions. The Communist Party in the US adopting the position that communism is 20th century Americanism and flying the stars and stripes, and similar kinds of things in Canada and elsewhere. And that political approach has all sorts of limitations when it actually comes to fighting fascism. And I think if people go into the history of the communist movement looking for ideas about how to fight the far right today, both the suicidal ultra-leftism that helped Hitler come to power in Germany and the Popular Front are very unhelpful strategic ways of thinking to deal with the far right in our own time. So I think it's important to be able to think critically about what kind of strategy the left needs here, and not to just draw on those dominant, that dominant inheritance, which would be what we would get in the communist movement. And then the other thing I would add, I guess, is just picking up on what I said in passing about the Popular Front, is the extent to which it was seen to be necessary to adopt nationalism, including in settler colonial imperialist societies, as part of the fight against the far right. And I think, just like we're seeing with the calls to all join with Team Canada today, I think we have to be very, very careful about that, because that appeal to Team Canada is going to be used to try to get people to accept slashed wages, tax on social programs, deregulation, further expansion of fossil fuel extraction, mining, a reactionary agenda that the Carney government is going to pursue in response to the crisis triggered by the Trump administration and its tariffs. Does that adequately kind of get at the things you were?
Yeah, definitely. I think Andrew's next question probably can get us even closer.
Yeah, so in the last chapter of the book, and I will say the book is just 140 pages, not including the endnotes. It is a very efficient, like impressively, almost not almost, it is remarkably succinct in how it covers such deep historical issues, so accessibly, so well, so richly. So in the last chapter, which is titled, What Can We Hope For? David, you say that there are many possible futures for humanity, some of which would be worse than the world we have today, and some of which could be much better. You state that, quote, what we can hope for, we must also work for. And that, quote, we should practice communist politics, unquote. So can you give us some practical examples, whether from your own experience or from present day, realities, of what it looks like to, quote, practice communist politics?
So I wanted to stress that in the book, I use communism with a small c to refer to the kind of politics that I'm arguing for, as opposed to capital C, the official communist movement, Marxism, Leninism, and so on. But in the sense of small c communist politics, the ability to actually practice those kind of politics, that's really shaped by the conditions in which we find ourselves. And I've never lived in a society that was in a social upheaval or anything like that. But I mean, just one little example from my own experience that I think might be useful. I was part of a really, it was really, for me, a significant experience, a strike that happened at York University, QP Local 3903, which is a union of student workers and contract faculty. Now many years ago, we were out for 11 weeks. And what was distinctive about the strike was that it was run in a very, very democratic way, with important decisions being taken in mass membership meetings, rather than being taken behind closed doors by, executive members, including when probably one of the turning points in the strike was when the police, the administration, the employers threatened to call the police on us to make us move our picket lines off the university property. And instead of just folding, as lawyers would probably have told, no insult to the lawyers in the room, but as many lawyers would have told, you know, the union executive to do, that there was a decision made to call a mass membership meeting, and there was a decision to defy this order, called their bluff, and in fact they didn't, you know, call for the police to move against us. But it was just that kind of democratically run strike stretching across 11 weeks, and that was the experience of actually having a strike run that democratically was very transformative for a lot of the participants in that. So I think that's that idea of trying to, when it does come to union struggles, to strikes, to have them run as democratically and in as participatory way as possible, rather than in a top-down or bureaucratic manner. There's one way of trying to make these kind of politics concrete in the here and now. And I think that wherever you see today people organizing in a way that is trying to advance defensive struggles or struggles to improve people's lives in a way that promotes that kind of democratic, militant, and solidaristic organizing. And especially when people are self-consciously aware that they're doing this and trying to link it to not just the immediate struggle, but to future possibilities, then I think that's trying to practice the kind of politics that the book is arguing for.
Thanks so much. And I think our last question, unless Tami speaks in an extra one, is from Tami here.
Sure, and then we'll gladly open it up to a broader discussion from the floor. So one of the things that I encounter sometimes, perhaps in defense of looking toward those AES, as you kind of turn it into an acronym, actually existing socialist societies, for inspiration or for, you know, how do we, as a guide to how we might, you know, practice communism. One of the justifications that I sometimes hear is, well, these are places that tried to make it happen in practice. Like these are examples of people attempting practical applications of this ideology that, you know, we agree with. And we may not like the results of what they've done, but, you know, we don't have anything else that's been tried to hinge our vision on. And I think in your last section, you argue, you know, we actually need to be more imaginative than that. We need to strive for something more ambitious and something that actually is rooted in the visions that were articulated in those early kind of communist ideas. But it needs to be rooted in both an awareness of that history and the realities that we're living in now. But this is very difficult, I think, and I think people struggle, like our media and our political reality make it much easier for us to lean on these, you know, examples of attempts at making this work than to sort of think, well, how are we going to make this thing materialize out of seemingly nothing? So I'd be interested for you to maybe say a little bit more about, you know, what are people who have, you know, the desire to strive for this vision to do with this sort of feeling that such a society is so potentially out of our reach, or at least it feels that way to many people.
Well, I think maybe one starting point, and the book says only a little bit about this, is to recognize the moment of history that we're in. That moment we're in is one still shaped by the collapse of the USSR and similar societies, which led to the conclusion that, as Francis Fukuyama, the US State Department intellectual, famously put it, that this was the end of history, that there was no, history was over, that there wouldn't ever be a fundamental contest about how societies would be organized. Liberal capitalism was it. And I still think there are all sorts of ways in which that shapes the way that people perceive the present, the past, and the future, in the sense that even people who are deeply opposed to this way of organizing society, capitalism, which is taking us into, you know, ever deeper ecological crisis and war and social inequality and so on, even people who are deeply opposed to it have a difficulty imagining that there might be a possible alternative, which is not something we've seen in the past, right? It still confines our imagination, the experience of the 20th century. And so the book's, you know, does try to argue that that's a mistake, that there are other possible forms of organizing society. And I think it's one of the saddest things about the moment we're living in, that people can only imagine an alternative to what exists that would be a recapitulation in some way of something that has already existed in human history. Because I think that there are all sorts of possibilities. I'm not arguing about what's likely. I'm just talking about what's possible. There are many, many different possible futures, and those include futures that are not simply repetitions of what we've seen in the past. Although there have been, of course, important revolutionary experiences which could inspire very, very different futures. So the Russian Revolution and the Spanish Revolution, other upheavals in the 20th century, and on a smaller scale and less advanced things that we've seen in the 21st that point towards other forms of social organization. And in the book, at one point, I tried to pick up a couple of ideas from the philosopher Ernst Bloch, who I have a lot of disagreements with, but I do think he has some useful ideas to say about the difference between what you could call passive possibility or potentiality and active possibility or capacity. And what I mean by that is we live in a world where there's extraordinary amount of potential to organize society differently. If you think about the extraordinary powers of human labor, through technology and social cooperation that exists today. I mean, it would be so much easier to do democratic economic planning today than has ever been the case in human history because of contemporary information technology. It would be extraordinarily easy compared to what it would have been like in the first half of the 20th century. And there's so much interconnectedness. And it's just, I think it's very easy for people to forget the difference between the kind of world in which we live and the world a century ago that was racked by upheaval through the Russian Revolution and the revolutionary wave that happened after that. The problem is not that kind of passive potentiality, if you like, but the problem of active capacity to actually break with capitalism and begin the process of reorganizing society. And I just think that we need to recognize that the way the world looks and the way the future looks from our moment in history is very much shaped by this moment. We know that, or I would argue that, the decades ahead, we're going to see much more of the things that we're beginning to see now in terms of social crisis, ecological crisis. And that's going to bring about a lot of suffering and a lot of horrors. But there's also the possibilities as that process develops of people really rejecting it and breaking with it and trying to move society in very different directions. And so I just think we need to take that big historical perspective and refuse to accept the idea, which is often unconscious for us, that history is closed. The idea that the future could only be a repetition or recapitulation of the past. History is open. That's terrifying in some ways, but it also has hopeful, liberatory possibilities. And I make no predictions. I think it's very unhelpful that the element of the history of the left that offers ungrounded optimism. I don't think that's helpful for us at this time. But the idea that if we recognize there are certain things that are possible, we should work towards trying to realize those possibilities in whatever small way we're able to do that at this particular point.
That's, I think, a very great note on which to perhaps turn it over to the floor if people have questions. Thank you.
In your imaginary society, you don't speak about power. And how I see politics, it's all about power. Whether it's on the right, in the middle, or on the left, it's all about power. And you never mentioned the word power once. Why is that?
Well, I'll say something about power now, in the sense that I think that the key question when it comes to social transformation is about who holds power, how is power organized, in a sense. Talk about it that way. I think power is very important, but we have to be specific about it. I don't think we should think about it in some kind of metaphysical way. Power is not just this transcendent thing, but we can talk about the power over productive resources in society, the power to determine who has access to the means of life and so on. So what the book argues for is ultimately the idea of a profound democratization of power, democratization of decision making. That's what in small c communism is really all about. It's about extension democracy to all the spheres of society, which today are completely undemocratic. We have no democratic control whatsoever in our workplaces. We have no democratic control whatsoever about the allocation of social resources and about the priorities, how the society's wealth is going to be used to produce what. And we have only those minimal kind of democracy when it comes to voting every 4 or 5 years to elect the people to run the government. And so that kind of dramatic extension and deepening of democracy and moving power into the hands, away from those who have it now, the tiny minority who actually exercise it most of the time, and to actually put it in the hands of ordinary people collectively. That's the heart of the emancipatory vision.
But ordinary people, for ordinary people, power is a psychological trait. Individuals love power. Each one of us in some way want power. And so how do you deal with this inherent human psychological trait?
I guess I don't share the premise, and so it would be a much more bigger discussion as we talk about human psychology, what's the impact of powerlessness. So much of us spend so much of our lives exercising very little power, very little ability to shape our lives. How does that affect how we relate to each other and to society as a whole? But I think that would be a much bigger conversation.
I have a single sign. I also have a question.
Could you hold the mic a little bit closer?
Sure, yeah. Having not read the book or flipped through it or anything, I just wonder, want to see the continuing evolution of capitalism causing many problems, unappetizing, etc. But why do you start with the word communism? And if so, why that concept? Because it also has a bad rep, as does capitalism. So just a very rudimentary, probably naive question, but could you try to address it?
Well, really, I mean, the book is, at the center of the book is an analysis about the kind of society that was first developed in the USSR and then, was also then created as a result of revolutions and other changes in other societies. And so it's fundamentally about that. And of course the word communism has a bad rap. I think it's worth still arguing, about that word and not just allowing it to be claimed by the defenders of Stalin and Mao, for example. But ultimately, it's not the word that matters; it's the ideas. And so, but the book doesn't deal with all. It's not a book about the history of communist thoughts or all possible political variations on that theme or anything like that. It does have a narrower focus.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question and then I'll pass this on. As I understand, the beginnings of the Russian Revolution and the writers behind it, it was very much a workers' movement, and yet peasants were not the workers, and they made up the largest group. And so they were not very appealing to the people who started the revolution, and not very involved, and also very hostile to the takeover of their resources, such as they were, and have suffered incredibly along that path. The sufferers were at the root, but removed, so to speak, for the workers, and now we have an ADP party. The game is about the workers and not about the poor, or don't include the poor, because they are not, I don't really know exactly why, but they're not included. Not useful, not smart enough, not organized, etc. So my question is, why go to the roots? Go to Russian communism at your roots, and the roots are not inclusive.
I mean, for anyone who's interested in the relationship between workers and peasants in the Russian Revolution, the book does talk a little bit about that and what happened in the years afterwards. But yeah, it was fundamentally a revolution in a society where most of the population was peasants, right? And the revolution was both a revolution of urban and rural wage workers, but also of peasants against the ruling class, which was both capitalists and landlords. The peasants were, very militant in seizing the land and rising up against the authorities in that revolution, which was a very important dynamic. But of course, once the peasants had seized control of the land, the peasants want to be left alone to farm. And in an extremely impoverished society, you cut off, because the whole thing was premised on the revolution spreading, and the revolution did not spread successfully, ultimately. There were enormous contradictions. You have the revolutionary regime trying to cling to power, but then having to extract food from the countryside in order to feed the urban population and the military during the civil war that ensued. It's that it wasn't that there was a negative attitude towards the peasants on the part of revolutionary leaders, but there was that real social contradiction that was playing out in that society. But I guess just more broadly, first of all, we live in a world today where the peasants, there's still peasants, still small farmers, but the global majority is no longer made up of people farming, as was once the case. And clearly, any kind of future radical changes to capitalism will be made by the direct producers, by ordinary people, workers and others, on the basis of the situation that they find themselves in. That's going to have to shape any kind of emancipatory political vision.
Thank you so much, first of all, for David, for yourself, and all the panelists. Really enjoyed the discussion. And my question for you is a little bit about the relationship between ideology and organization that you lay out here. I get a clear sense of this sort of the ideology of small c communism, socialism from below that you lay out, and I agree with a lot of it. But I'm less clear about the what kind of organizational forms you propose for kind of creating that real democratic kind of society. You talk a little bit about the need to kind of go fight for more democratic, control over all areas of society. But I'm curious of what that would look like for you.
I'm going to ask maybe a question to see if you could clarify the question. Are you thinking about in terms of how people would organize democratically in the process of transforming society, or about the nature of the society itself, or a society in transition towards?
I guess my question is more about kind of now. What struck me is you talked about your experiences in QP 3903 and this kind of mass democratic participatory strikes. And I have friends who are militants in that union right now, and from what I gather, it's a very different kind of union. It's really changed in a very bureaucratic direction. And so I think a lot of the labor movement, in my experience, has continued down that path. And to start building towards a transition towards a different kind of society, we need to reorient the labor movement, all sorts of other kinds of aspects of society towards being even capable of having that mass democratic participation. So how would we do that, basically, is the question I pose to you.
Well, I don't have an easy answer to that, but I'm going to quote something from the book and maybe say a little bit about it. Fine. So you might recognize this quotation. Other people might recognize it too, but I think maybe others won't. So meaningful action is whatever increases the confidence, the autonomy, the initiative, the participation, the solidarity, the equalitarian tendencies, and the self-activity of the masses, and whatever assists in their demystification. Sterile and harmful action is whatever reinforces the passivity of the masses, their apathy, their cynicism, their differentiation through hierarchy, their alienation, their reliance on others to do things for them, and the degree to which they can therefore be manipulated by others, even by those allegedly acting on their behalf. So that, which comes from a statement of a British small socialist group in the late 60s, I think says something about the approach in general terms, but how does that actually translate into practice in the society, in the here and now? It can't be a situation where we wait to have organizations that fully conform to this kind of model. We have to work with what exists. So it means, whether you have unionized workplaces, people need to work to try to change their unions, confronting the problems that people are facing. When workplaces that aren't unionized, people should try to unionize them. But there are lots of workplaces where that's not immediately practical, of course, but there are also other ways that people can be organized through worker centers, through various kinds of community organizing to try to confront the problems that they face in the here and now. And the question is, can that be done as much as possible in that spirit of that quotation? And for people who actually want to link that to a vision of a different kind of society, there are ways of doing that. It doesn't mean, I want to make it very clear, it's not about going around shouting at people, revolution, or anything like that. It's about practically trying to respond to the problems that people find in their lives, but doing this in a way that tries to open up opportunities for people to better understand what is it that has created these conditions that we find ourselves, in the world today, and how could they be different, and beginning to introduce what can we learn from history. And so different kinds of popular education, other kinds of education we can get into with the people that we're working with in our unions or community organizations. I think that's really important. In my first book, I talked about trying to reinvent the working class movement, and that's what I think we do need to do as well as build a new anti-capitalist left that's very much part of that process.
I think the question that neighbor here asked about power is an important one. And I mean, there will always be some kind of power dynamics, but I remember years ago in a class I took on community development and education, there was talk about power over people, or sharing power, and having power with people. So, and I think we're reflecting a lot on what's happened partially from a Eurocentric kind of approach. And in that regard, looking forward, I think there's something to be learned from also seeing what's happening in our backyards. So with a decolonization approach from indigenous peoples, and what's happening internationally that we can learn about. And I think this is going to be more and more challenging because we're becoming more individualistic. And I think that's kind of a global thing through the internet and everybody having their own phone and how we're interacting that way. And I also read an interesting book. I don't remember what it stands for, but it's called Weird, and it's about basically looking at things through a more Eurocentric kind of individualistic approach, or how many societies operate internationally, more collectivist and more looking at the common good. So I think we have to kind of connect the dots between that local and what we're doing in our day-to-day lives, and the bigger picture on the means of production and bigger political power. Because like I've been to meetings, I've been to political meetings, I've been to union meetings, and sometimes I think I'm in a boardroom or something, and there are really definitely very strong power dynamics. But in learning from Indigenous colleagues, in taking a course in pre-colonial African history and stuff, and there's much to be learned about how societies have indeed tackled some of these issues through different cultural lenses and such. So I'm wondering if anybody else has any reflections on that.
I'll just say really briefly that I do think what some people call it the Indigenous resurgence that's taking place today, has been taking place for some time, is very hopeful and inspiring. But it would be a huge mistake for non-Indigenous people to somehow just say that, well, that solves our problems for us or something like that. But there's, it's, I think, really important for us to support struggles against settler colonialism and to learn from them. This is also just not a new thing. I mean, Marx actually was very interested in Indigenous social organization, and there's a great pamphlet you can find online by the surrealist Franklin Rosemont called Karl Marx and the Iroquois, which actually does a great job of talking about some of this. But so I think that, again, small c communists have often been interested in drawn to try to understand Indigenous societies before the arrival of European colonialism in the Americas for good reason. But again, I don't think that solves the political problems, but it is an important element of thinking about transformative politics today.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you to everybody, and thank you to our speakers and to all of you for your questions. We are now going to move over to our signing portion of the evening. So please feel free to approach the signing table to my right to have a book signed. You can have a book signed before you pay for the book. Just make sure you pay for the book before you leave. And thank you again to all of you, to Fernwood Publishing, Tanya, Tami, Andrew, and of course, to David Camfield. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Come on, Camfield. Yeah.